Hi, everybody. This is your Professor Ian. I'm just recording this short video as an update for week 3. Basically, what I want to do is reflect on what we did last week and then remind you of a couple things we're working on this week. So last week, we got into some primary texts, right? So that a primary text is, a text written by someone who was actually there, an eyewitness, one of the representative texts of an era. So the theogony and works and days, we got into those last week, and I gave you most of both texts, or at least most of the theology to read. And everybody did a great job. The comments and perusal were like fantastic. I was a little worried just because there's a lot to read, and as people pointed out, you had to read through it several times to get what was happening. Sometimes as a number of people talked about the poetic nature of it. And yeah, I mean, it was a poem, right? So it's written. It's not like a short story and written in that sense. I can't remember who talked about the structure of it. I can't remember, but the structure seems weird, and yeah, because it's a poem, right? It's not written in that like story way with one central arc. It's like a series of like quests almost that Zeus goes on to prove himself and go through this. Some people noted. Katie said that some parts were boring, and that's true. And I even cut out big chunks that are even more boring about the lineage of other gods that nobody cares about, right? Except for classicists. Nicole said there are so many names it's ridiculous, and that's true too. And I remember I warned you that you don't have to know half of these names. If something interests you, if you're interested in Styx and that idea, then go for it. But otherwise, don't worry about it too much. A lot of the gods in the theogony are just like personifications of abstract things. Like notice how he capitalizes a lot of words like night and talks about night almost as though it's a being, right? But doesn't really have a personality or a backstory in the story. That's because it's a personification of this idea of night as a god, right? Same with the muses. There was a lot of discussion about the muses, which is, was interesting. I'm glad people did that research. That's great. But the muses are basically just personifications of, poetry or music, right? They're the goddesses that kind of, are the inspiration for and look over that discipline of artistic endeavor, right? Hence, sometimes we talk about a muse today, like my muse is whatever, this person, this idea, and that inspires me to do my art, right? So don't get too wound up in that if you don't want to. If you like that, if something sparks your interest, go ahead and do that deep dive and look into it. But otherwise, just let it wash over you. Don't worry about it. We're mostly interested in the Olympian gods because they really do, as we see in week 3, form this nexus of everything that happens in Greek mythology. But people really seem to like reading the theology, which was really, good for me. I mean, I'm glad everybody enjoyed it. I like Christine pointed out that she appreciated having the comments available through perusal. So a lot of the questions she was thinking about earlier in the week, she went back and people had looked into it and answered that, or had a conversation about that. So that was great. And that's why, using perusal is great to go back a couple times, right? Go earlier in the week, do some reading, come back later, see what people were talking about, and see if that helps you understand some of the ideas. That's the ideal way to use perusal. Hopefully, when you just use it all at the last minute, you can get like all the comments and conversations, but it's best to be part of that ongoing conversation. It's like being in class. If you're there and you're engaged, you're going to get a lot more out of it. So theogony, Carlos noted that, it is very poetic. There's a lot of analogies, metaphors. You need to be aware of that. And a lot of the stuff we read this semester is going to be that way. Everything was written as poetry. At that time, things weren't written as like stories and novels. Those didn't really exist in Greek culture. Also, Carlos, nice puppy, very cute. Carlos, not to keep talking about Carlos too much, but he also notes the dynastic element of this, of the theogony, right? This passing down from father to son of power. That was very much, Greek culture. It was very paternalistic that way, where the father would pass down ruling of an area or a kingdom to the son, right? Didn't really go to female descendants, right? This was not an egalitarian society, even though, Athens is the world's first democracy. Remember, women didn't vote, foreigners didn't vote. It was only like Athenian males who owned property, not even, there was slavery at the time too, so slaves could not vote either. So we call it the world's first democracy, but it's very limited, right? It's something to keep in mind, not the society we're used to. And on that note, there's one point where Elizabeth asked, there's a line in the Theogony towards the beginning. The line is, but afterwards she lay with heaven and bore someone, and bore the, I think it's the giants. And the she in that sense is Gaia, right? And, but afterwards she, Gaia, lay with heaven. And yes, Elizabeth and everybody else, that is sexual, right? It's a sexual union between Gaia and heaven. And remember, Gaia is her son as well, in a way. She bore heaven earlier in that same passage. So incest is definitely part of this, right? Zeus and Hera are brother and sister, and they are the first couple of the Olympian family. There's all kinds of incest and sexual union in Greek mythology. And, again, this goes back to Carlos talking about metaphors and things like this. Like, yeah, they're brother and sister, but they're also gods. So they're not really brothers and sisters in some ways, but, but they are. So just something to keep in mind. There is a lot of incest and sexuality. I probably should have mentioned that earlier. What else was I going to talk about? People loved reading the Pandora story, which is great. One thing to bear in mind, we're going to find out in week 3, this is just Hesiod's version of a lot of these stories, right? They're authoritative in the sense that he is this older figure in Greek mythology, and a lot of people turn to his text as an authoritative account, but they're not the only version, right? In both Theogony and Works and Days, there's a lot of misogyny that comes through, right? There's a lot of anti-female rhetoric going on, right? But one of the things I think about too when I'm reading Hesiod is comparing it to Christian theology, right? So, Paul, the Apostle Paul, wrote, it's better to burn. What is it? Let me look up I had it up here on my page. He writes, now to the unmarried and the widows, I say, this is from Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, now to the unmarried and widows, I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I am, but if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So he's basically saying a similar thing to what Hesiod was saying, that if you don't get married, it's lonely and you're alone in the world. But if you do get married, you're subject to these problems, right? So there's this same theme running through some of Christianity as well. Not all of Christianity, but Paul definitely had a similar thing to say about marriage and women. Paul's often criticized being misogynist as well, right? So if you think this is just isolated to Greek culture, there are connections to other things. As well, you might want to think about in Works and Days, the 5 generations, right? Gold, silver, bronze, heroic, iron, right? You might want to think about these generations as similar to the story of the Garden of Evil or the Garden of Eden, and right, this kind of falling, and in fact, the book of Genesis in general is falling away from God, right? The Tower of Babel, the Garden of Eden, right? There's in the book of Genesis in the Bible, there's this constant movement or actions of humans to move themselves further away from God, right? They continue to disappoint him and sin in these serious ways that get them pushed further and further away from their relationship with God. And there's a similar thing happening in Hesiod's writing, right? Especially Works and Days, where back in the Golden Age, human and gods lived together. They were together in that way, very close, but they get pushed further and further. We can also read Prometheus as part of this too, right? Prometheus is kind of like this Adamic figure, right? He tastes from the tree of good, of knowledge of good and evil, like in the Garden of Eden, right? Instead, for Prometheus, he takes fire, technology, innovation, right? This knowledge to humans, and separates them from God in this very serious way by giving them this, trying to usurp God's knowledge, just like Adam did in the story from the Bible, right? So you can read these in similar ways, because these are traditions that were happening at the same time, right? If we're thinking about 800 BCE, that was the Judaic tribes were around at the same time. There were other Near Eastern cultures with similar stories. So this is all happening in the same world, right? So the stuff that's happening in the Greek mythology has its counterparts in other cultures. We don't get to spend a lot of time this semester looking at that, but it's, comparative mythology is a fascinating topic you might want to think about. Anyways, back to theology. I loved everybody loved the battle scenes with the Titans at the end, and the comparisons to Lord of the Rings and Avengers and Justice League were fun. It's a very cinematic part of the poem. It's really a lot of fun. You can see how it influenced a lot of later writers. So I think that was about it. I did like in Works and Days, Chris described it as like reading some kind of abstract and artistic self-help motivational book. So that was funny. A lot of people picked up on this idea that it wasn't like an advice manual, and it really is, right? He's it's framed that he's writing it to his brother Percy's, but he's meditating on the nature of human life and the two kinds of strife, right? And what it means to live a good life. This is a big thing for Greek thinkers and philosophers. What is the good life, right? And Hesiod is definitely reflecting on this a lot in Works and Days. Okay, so I just want to reflect on that a little bit. I'm going to mark your reflections from last week on Wednesday. So I'll get to those on Wednesday. I want to remind you about the Pop Culture Mythology Project. A lot of people have taken part in the discussion forums, but please make sure you get in there right away and decide which figure your group wants to work on. You don't have that long to work on it. It's not a huge project, but you do need to start that ball rolling right away, okay? I'm going to remind people who haven't commented yet in the forums, but I would suggest if you're part of a group and someone hasn't commented yet, go ahead planning without that person, okay? And then if they do show up, hopefully they do show up and start participating, assign them a role ahead of time. That way when they show up, you can just say, okay, listen, we already decided we're going to work on X figure. I'm going to do this. She's going to do that. He's going to do that. Here's what we need you to do, okay? So go ahead and do your planning as if they're going to show up. And then, midweek, if they don't show up, I'll get in touch with all the groups and we'll coordinate. And if they don't show up, just plan to do their work for them, right? Or we can work on a truncated version of your projects. Anyways, keep working on those pop culture mythology projects. And I also posted a bonus assignment. It's a really intriguing video. I reference in my lecture this in week 3 it's a video about Greek music. And I thought it would actually be a useful thing for everybody to take a look at. So, pardon me. You can look at it anytime this semester. Next, I guess we don't have that long, 6 weeks. Take a look at that and think about how it helps you think about Greek mythology, because the music was very different. We tend to think of Greek music as somebody strumming on a harp, but it was not like that according to experts in the field. So please take a look at that video if you wish. Even if you don't do the bonus assignment, it's still a super fun video with this. This guy does some circular breathing. He's playing these two pipes, and it's just an amazing thing to see. He's like playing for like 5 minutes straight without stopping to take a breath, because he's breathing in through his nose and then taking the breath into his mouth and pushing it while he's still breathing. It's just, it blows my mind. Anyways, check that out. And otherwise, have a good day and enjoy reading about the Olympian gods.